Last October, the government published the Employment Rights Bill, a slate of reforms set to change workers' rights in the UK, from banning fire and rehire tactics to ending exploitative zero-hours contracts to giving workers employment protection from day one. The bill has passed through the Commons and is currently on its third reading in the House of Lords. The first changes are expected to be enacted next year. But what does this bill really mean for workers, businesses and the economy? And could there be unintended consequences that even its biggest supporters are concerned about? I'm joined today by Mike Clancy, General Secretary of Prospect, one of the UK's leading trade unions representing over 150,000 professionals across science, engineering and technology. Mike, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the meat of this bill, can you maybe tell our listeners what your involvement has been in shaping it so far?
Okay, well, as you kindly said, Prospect's one of the major trade unions affiliated to the Trade Union Congress. We don't affiliate to the Labour Party, but we have a wide lobbying and political engagement strategy. Our members span the public and private sector. Most of our members are in the private sector, and therefore the bill's content is particularly important in terms of the extent to which trade unions can regain a stronger foothold in the private sector, a theme I'm sure we'll return to. We've been talking to government and influencing the political process as the bill has passed through Parliament. Myself, I'm on the ACAS Council, and I'm also involved with the business department, so I'm able to bring a perspective and a commentary to that. And I think what we are seeing is the biggest legislative change in the world of employment for 14, 15 years. So not surprisingly, it's got both its major supporters and it's got its challenges as well.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you put it in that context because, when was the last time, in your experience, of representing your members and working in this area, was the last time that we had a government intervention on employment rights on this scale?
Well, the last time we had a favourable intervention by in law when seen from the perspective of workers or trade unions is literally 14, 15 years ago. This is in the context of the previous administration, both for its own employees, but more generally, seeing dialogue with trade unions and workplace representatives as something to avoid, to minimise. And consequently, the legislative direction, particularly after we left the European Union with the regulatory reform bill, was all too clear. I mean, there were very siren voices, Britannia Unchained thinking in the previous administration, which they wanted to put into practice. And I think but for the Labour win in the election last year, we would have seen far more dismantling of the influence of European laws on employment law in the UK. We'd have seen far more deregulation, and we'd have seen far more exploitation. I think it's very difficult to find a credible commentator that would say that the UK labour market doesn't need any proportionate re-regulation. We've seen the consequences of exploitation for different groups, and we've seen that actually go across occupations you wouldn't normally maybe associate it with. In the place that we operate amongst professional managers, specialists, we saw it with Mr. Musk and when he took over Twitter, and how people in technical and IT jobs can suddenly be commodified, just as the Uber driver or the other people who are applying the finding an income to support themselves in precarious parts of the economy. So it's way overdue, but that's not to say that in this process of change, it's not necessary to take employers with us.
Yes. Yeah. And I it's interesting when you think about this legislation, perhaps as a casual observer, you may be thinking about the Uber drivers that you mentioned, people, couriering for Deliveroo, the people who work for P&O ferries who were laid off, all at once, or even, the public sector workers that are going on strike, for example. But we don't think so much about the workers that you've just been talking about. Can you tell us a bit about how this bill could be a positive change for those workers that you represent?
Well, in the private sector, we have arrived at a largely voiceless economy. When it comes to pay, fairness at work, equality, employers have enjoyed untrammeled authority. And we would say as a trade union for too long. And it's necessary now to see a proportionate but durable change in the way that British capitalism goes about being successful and productive. So the people that Prospect represent tend to be in technical roles, air traffic management, power engineering. We have a huge membership in the creative sector through our BEC2 community. And in that area, we represent about 20,000 freelancers and who are regularly in the headlines for sometimes less positive reasons than we would want because of power relationships, precariety, and so on. But we represent people who are key to the future of this country's productivity and growth ambitions, whether that be in infrastructure, I've mentioned aviation and energy, or in the creative sector where we are a leading nation. What this will allow us to do is with employers we already negotiate with is to solidify those relationships and make sure they're endurable for the long term. But what it should allow us to do, and this is the important thing for trade unions to do, is to go through the doors that the Labour Party and the Employment Rights Bill points us at, whereby we can say to employers, look, we've now got rights of access, both physical and digital. And of course, with the changes in the nature of the economy, having digital access to talk to potential members and create, bodies of people who wish to see their terms and conditions governed through collective bargaining, that access right is absolutely crucial. Because the hard truth for trade unions is that we have 13% trade union membership in the private sector, around about 20-odd% collective agreement coverage. And we need to use this period and whatever period the Labour government may get, if it gets a second term, to make sure that we've changed those numbers substantially so that the public sector trade union membership and trade union behaviours don't look like an oddity. Because they're very capable of being lampooned by negative commentators, usually from the right. Why are public sector workers got trade unions? Why have they got sick pay? Why have they got pensions? And if we're not careful, we build an economy on equality of misery arguments. We haven't got that. We're taxpayers, so why should you have that in the public sector?
Yeah.
I mean, look, there's a lot of pent-up frustrations. We saw it when the inflation figures were going particularly north a couple of years ago. I don't believe that was a durable renaissance of trade union activity.
Right.
I think it was a specific response to economic conditions at the time. But there is a great deal of, I think, workplace dissonance in the UK. And a lot of people feeling that they don't get voice, they don't get a fair say, there isn't equity in pay, there are manifest equality issues in relation to pay and pensions, and they want something done about it. Now, that should be a space in which trade unions can step in. But I do believe unions also need to make a positive offer. We style ourselves as the union of ambition, of success. We want our members to grow and develop at work. A lot of the people we represent want to be successful. They want to get on. That's something to be lauded and amplified. But also we're there when, conditions are difficult and we can negotiate with employers and problem solve. I think unions spend a little bit too much time talking about the negative. Sometimes you have to take action. Sometimes you have to oppose employers. But leading with that all the time, I think, can be a turn-off. What we try to say is we're problem solvers. We want to work with employers, but equally want to make sure our members' rights are properly enforced and amplified. The fact that the Employment Rights Bill can come to its detail in a minute is basically saying to UK employers, it's time for change. We're rebalancing the economy. You need to treat your workforce in a fair, long-term manner. Where your workforce wants trade unions, we believe that's positive for public policy to support. And we want a form of positive, growth-focused capitalism, which is not exploitative. What's not to like if that's the outcome of the Employment Rights Bill?
Yeah. And what do you think are the obstacles to that being the outcome? You've laid out what could be the positives. What are the potential risks to this bill in terms of that future of trade union relationship with business and with its own members, do you think?
Look, I think there was good political sense in trying to get the bill onto the parliamentary process within 100 days, but that was pretty rapid. And it does mean that that employment law is a highly detailed, all areas of law are detailed and complex, but employment law is right up there. And consequently, fashioning a bill to change the direction in the workplace after 14, 15 years of going in a different direction was always going to be a huge endeavour. So there is devil in the detail. Mm-hmm. There is things which still have to be worked through. I think it's really important for trade unions and, the government, actually, that employers don't conclude that this is a bill that will worsen employee relations, that will worsen industrial relations. There has to be a philosophy and a direction that this is about balance obligations on both sides and a better dialogue. I think working people want their unions and they want their employers to solve things. Conflict is inevitable parts of some workplaces, and if the model of employment is particularly exploitative, it's almost inevitable. But the vast majority of working people go to work to succeed, to make their livelihood. And what I think it's really important is that the bill enables that. Mm. And what it doesn't do is cause more division or more, put it in simple terms, strikes.
Yeah.
And if it can be lampooned as the strikes bill, Labour's got a problem. So that's one challenge. I think the second thing is, because unions have been pushed a little bit to the margin, industrial relations skills, how people negotiate, compromise, reach agreements for the long term is a bit of a lost art. Mm-hmm. And most organisations we talk, and in particular, we've been doing a lot of work with the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, to some extent, the representatives of the people we negotiate across the table. And they would agree with us. We've done quite a lot of work which has caught the eye of government and others about how do we develop the skills so that we do negotiate well.
Right.
Negotiations should not be about polar positions. So unions just making demands that don't flex and change or reflect the product market or circumstance of the employer is as much of a problem an employer saying, we've decided this, we're now going to tell you. Mm. There has to be a longer term, more complex set of relationships that allow for a better dialogue at work so that we solve these problems. And that's why the Twitter, the P&O are seen as so egregious behaviours.
Yeah.
Dismissing people by electronic means. As I said to you earlier, I'm a member of the ACAS Council. ACAS is crucial in being a tripartite organisation. That means business, trade unions, independents under the government umbrella. And it's survived. It's actually flourishing. And it does show you that tripartite conversations can work. We do know how to do this. We just need to do it more. And I think the government will need to find a few more places in which it convenes capital and labour to talk about how do we land this bill well.
Yeah.
Right, we are set on this public policy change, but how do we make it land well for working people, their unions, and employers? Because employers will have fears, right? If the media mainly talk about strikes, that's all employers hear when they hear the word union. What they don't hear is the 90% of the time we spend with existing employers, sometimes working with them to lobby for the interests of their sector with government and others. Other times, negotiating change. And of course, we could spend the whole podcast talking about the next wave of change in the workplace related to technology, AI. These are now daily stories of either is it overblown or is it round the corner? What's the consequence for working people? And, that will have to be handled through better dialogue. And we've got international competitors. There are a number of countries, we always talk about the Nordics, but who do it better. And I suppose in a way, what we hope with the Employment Rights Bill is that we all get a little bit more Scandi. Yeah. That we do these things through, capitalism have a long-term frame, accepts that working people have voice. And I've always felt that if you give the right conditions to businesses that are durable and long-term and clear, they'll make money. They don't have to exploit people. And I think that's what is crucial that this bill is now presented as. Yeah. It's a means for, better relationships at work, not more disputes.
Yeah, because are there some areas of vulnerability in the representation of this bill, or like how it lands, as you put it? Because I think in the public imagination who, aren't, sort of, they aren't ingrained in the sort of language around trade unions and the detail of this bill, I think they would think of, unions as the bin collectors in Birmingham, for example, or the resident doctors on strike in the NHS. And so how much of that kind of populist vision of unions is shaping the way that the bill has been sold so far? I mean, there are people in government who like to use the example of this bill as saying we are actually, you know, a government of the left, rather than being constantly critiqued from the left as a government who are parroting the language of the right.
Well, look, good employers come in different shapes and sizes. And bad employers do as well. And bad employers undercut the brand and the public perception of employers more generally. There can be moments when trade unions get locked in dispute situations where if you stand back, you've possibly lost sight of what the dispute was about in the first place. And with social media and media generally, all of that gets amplified. So there's an undoubted vulnerability. I think 2026 is a key year now in this respect. Either the consultation process with business and so on will go well, and a degree of this will calm down. I mean, the interesting barometer is that those employers who deal with trade unions are not really shouting about this because they know what unions do day in, day out. They work with them, right? Despite sometimes the headlines, all unions succeed in making deals, removing friction, solving things before they become a problem, too great a problem. And I think what you're giving me the opportunity to do is make that point, right? And sometimes the media context doesn't offer the opportunity for a more sophisticated, developed conversation where we're contacted when, is there going to be a dispute in X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
Well, you weren't. So, you know, we haven't actually had a major dispute in parts of aviation, air traffic management in particular, in 30-odd years. Doesn't mean we haven't come close. Doesn't mean that we don't have vigorous collective bargaining and at times some serious disagreements with some employers. But because we solve them, they don't hit the headlines, right? Air traffic control problems in Europe hit the headlines every summer, don't they? And look at that contrast. So I think I think there is that vulnerability, but the best barometer is employers who deal with unions are not frightened by this bill. They've got high standards. They make goods or they make services in the context of those union relationships. And often, they might whisper it quietly at times, they really value having the union there as an independent, critical friend. And also someone they can turn to and say, we're thinking about this. How do you think this is going to land? And, you know, the value of being a trade union official, what I've devoted my career to, life to, is that, you know, you've got the privilege of speaking truth onto power.
Yeah.
But how you use that as a trade union official is so important. You know, I often say in my own organization, when we say to an employer, don't do this, they need to not do it because they don't hear us saying no all the time. So like relationships, if you're constantly arguing with somebody, eventually they probably just become oral wallpaper, don't they? Whereas if prospect says, look, I think you've got a problem with this. If you've got a previous hinterland of working constructively, not being anybody's, patsy or anything, but constructively understanding the employer, understanding the long term and the members' aspirations and vulnerabilities and so on. But then you say, don't do this. Now, that's again takes you back to the skills.
Yeah. Because
if voices in the boardroom don't also have the capacity to influence the boardroom and say, our union's saying this is a problem, I think we should listen. This is the stuff we've got to get back and find again so that we avoid the disputes. But disputes will happen. We have a very, dynamic economy. Businesses want to get on and do things. This, if we're not careful, we will have lots of two different speeds in this economy. You will have the people who remain exploited because of the nature of their work. You'll have some people who can navigate it, and you'll have a very small group at the top who are running it.
Yeah.
And I think, again, the employment bill in terms of philosophy is about a degree of equalisation. We've just had the usual garish figures of the multipliers of, average wages compared to CEO wages and so on.
Yeah.
And these things all impact people's attitude to, am I getting a fair deal?
Yeah. And you've expressed fear about one of the headline aspects of the bill, fire and rehire. Can you explain what your concerns are about that?
Well, when fire and rehire happens, or fire and replace, because there's different blends of this, and again, for your listeners, you can go off into all sorts of, acronyms and nomenclature and whatnot, so, try and stay away from that. But when basically a workforce doesn't do what it's told, and has its terms and conditions just willfully changed on a collective basis, everybody knows that's wrong. And everybody is against that. And good employers are against that. Nobody was saying that the P&O approach or Elon Musk with Twitter and a few other examples is anything other than, unacceptable in any workplace at any time. So that concept, fire and rehire or fire and just replace, has no place in a balanced economy. What you've got to watch, though, is that when you frame the law to prevent it, you don't prevent inadvertently all sensible negotiation around terms and conditions and change.
Right.
Because not all negotiations on change are fire and rehire and fire and replace. So this is a bit of a technical point, which we've just wanted to make sure the government are alive to. Look, don't get yourself into a position, again, about the public perception of this, where you lose public support for the core point of the behaviours you want to remove. But unions and employment group, workers and unions should be able to negotiate sensible change where there's been consent ultimately, and the law shouldn't prevent that. And it's about just making sure that we frame this properly. Goes back to the earlier point. This bill is replacing a whole range of behaviours that are built up over 15 years. Don't be surprised then that it's a bit difficult to write it all down.
Yeah.
And write it all down in a statute. And it's a big statute. And it's got a lot of moving parts. So we've just been saying, please make sure that you've got a laser-like focus on the policy area that we fully support you on, which is no fire and rehire, no fire and replace. But sensible change, and change is all around us, it's a constant feature, should be capable of being negotiated.
Yeah, and how optimistic are you that they're listening to your concerns about that particular provision of the bill?
I believe the government is navigating this as best they can currently, and inevitably, again, you'll have some unions saying there must be no movement on this at all, because if you make any movement, the whole thing is going to fall away as a policy proposition. And some employers saying we should be able to do whatever we want to do whenever we want to do it. It's finding that sweet spot in the middle. And I think the government is edging towards that now and wants to be in a position where it doesn't inadvertently prevent sensible negotiation reached after due process, because that's not in working people's interest either.
Yeah.
I think it's important that unions don't get tarred with it because it's dead easy. Computer says no.
Yeah.
Usually it is maybe, but what about? And here's what our members think about it. And then a process of proper discussion. Again, a lot of employers have got used to fashioning all their change in their private discussions and then presenting to the workforce something that's fully fledged, and then there is a simple facade of consultation.
Yeah.
The words even now require employers to engage with their workforces when they're contemplating something, and then they give conscientious consideration to what their workforce feedback is, and they try to reach agreement. Now, in those three little cameos of when you're starting to think about it, talk to people, conscientiously consider their feedback and adjust your proposals if necessary, and seek to reach agreement. If we could do more of that, we don't need to worry about fire and rehire, because that won't be necessary, because you'll have a proper process to deal with change over time.
Yeah.
And that's particularly important in the private sector. It's important in the public sector. The public sector's been through huge amounts of change, and it's likely to go through a huge amount more. We represent a lot of civil servants, and that's an area which we see that all the time, far more than the press sometimes, and some commentators realise. But it's the private sector in particular. The pace of change, the next range of technological advances means that taking your workforce with you is more important than ever.
Yeah. And how about, you'll represent workers on 0 hours contracts. How about the provisions for limiting 0 hours contracts in the bill? Are you concerned about that?
Well, again, it's fire and rehire and 0 hours contracts have entered our lexicon, but they're not actually currently legal concepts. So you're trying to, you couldn't go to a statute now and say a definition of a 0 hours contract is X, Y, and Z. But we know what it is when you see it.
Yeah.
And you know what it is in practice. So what the legislation is trying to do is both define and limit. So it's necessarily complex. And you know an exploitative contract when you see one. It tends to be in a situation where the person offering their work is easily substitutable. Where, and these are important skills, but say driving skills and other things of that nature, where another individual could offer themselves at a lower rate and employers exploit that. And then the whole 0 hours process is built upon it. People need certainty, and they need to be able to, subsist and actually have decent lives. And 0 hours contracts conceptually are not a basis for that. They put all of the risk. It's a bit like, we're now in the era of defined contribution pension schemes. It's a big shift of risk to working people away from a balance of risk sharing with an employer. What, again, you have to be careful with, and it comes down to the drafting, is that where people do have flexible contracts for good reason, because of the nature of the production, or the fact that they've got skills they can offer and they're not as exploitable, that you don't prevent that. So go back to my freelance example. A lot of our freelance members have union clauses in their freelance agreements, because in film, TV, we have negotiated with some of the major employer formations to have provisions about how people are put to work, but they're then self-employed people who go to work, but they've got a craft skill. I'm always very proud when I see the end credits of film and TV. Those are the people that Prospect Bectu represent. They've got skills and they're not as exploitable because they're not as substitutable. But do they also experience precariety and boom and bust? Absolutely. And that's why other parts of the government's policy prescriptions on industrial strategy, we welcome the freelance commissioner. These are important things, important steps to try and bring balance and fairness. So I think you've got to see the Employment Rights Bill in a broader context. Employment Rights Bill deals with the legislative framework, but you've got industrial strategy, and you've also got important things like the freelance commissioner, which we argued for, where, again, the government's recognising businesses need to succeed, but not at the exploitation of individual workers.
And is there a fear that the Employment Rights Bill might throw out that flexibility needed by some of those workers that you were just mentioning?
That would be the fear, provided that ultimately the drafting is clear enough, and then, but also you take employers with it. Ultimately, it's that phrase, isn't it? The battle plan really survives first contact with the enemy. I'm always trying to remind myself who said that, but it's that sort of feel to it. When this legislation gets into the hands of the workplace and it gets into lawyers and judges, there will be challenges, because there always are. But I think, we've got a period now to get this as precise as possible through the consultation process. And it's really, I think, to be fair to government, they have been really trying to listen to both, businesses, workers and trade unions to try and get this as right as possible.
The government is staking quite a bit of its reputation, particularly among left voters, on this bill and the success of this bill and what it symbolises. I wonder if you could talk about the politics of it. Do you think it's going to fulfil, those political needs of the government to show that it is still a left-wing government, that it is still trying to do radical things?
Well, the Employment Rights Bill and the broader Make Work Pay agenda, because we shouldn't forget that certain other features are not yet worked through, I think is its absolute fulcrum for saying we want growth and prosperity, but not at the expense of working people. And that we are not a deregulatory government. We are not purveyors of Singapore on Thames. We don't buy into a model for this country that concentrates power and wealth in a select few hands. We're about a degree of distribution, but we're also about bringing employers with us. So I think that's what generally conforms to left wing. It's what animates my economics, and it is the debate that rages still across the globe. Are working people going to be facing a new period of accelerated exploitation through AI, capitalism concentrated in, very few select hands, and the consequences of that for societal breakdown, if you put it at its height? So, I mean, I think that the government will understandably, in terms of political concerns, want to point to that as their left-wing credentials. But I think it's simply more fundamental. If the Labour Party are not doing this, what are the Labour Party?
Yeah.
Whilst my union doesn't affiliate to the Labour Party, I'm always clear I've personally been a Labour Party member for many years. It's what my social democratic politics would expect, that a Labour government gives working people a fair shout, that it sees trade unions as a public good. I mean, I often say to employers when I've the privilege of speaking at events, well, what do you want from public policy? Would you like to see a workplace where there are no trade unions? And there's very few employers who see that in a democratic context, that unions should be eradicated, that there should be zero trade union membership in the economy. Now, employers then wanting to take the further step of saying, yeah, I think employers in my workplace will be a good thing, is another matter. It's a bit like, trade unions always have a higher approval rate than they do have a joining rate. People approve of the concept of trade unions. But what's important to trade unions so that we have independent voices, that you join us, and be active and contribute, because people sometimes think, obviously, we're an extension of the state or something, but no, we exist. Our independent voice exists because members pay us a subscription, and we're able to therefore be these critical actors in the economics of the country. Labour must enable that, or it's undifferentiated from any other political party. It can't do it in a way that is cavalier and without concern to what it means for business decisions. And of course, we're hearing all of the consequences from different business lobby in relation to national insurance and other parts of, the decisions the government's had to take. But the government is right that the ERB and Make Work Pay is a absolute signpost policy for this Parliament, and it must not step away from it.
Yeah. And is there a philosophy to it? I mean, does it hang together coherently? Because sometimes it can seem, at least when you read sort of the headlines about it, that it's kind of a grab bag of union asks from, over the past few years. Well,
inevitably someone has to make the asks and set an agenda, and that is the role of trade unions. And because we are the commentators from the workplace with the most independence, the most experience, it's still, we want it to be larger, but it's still the largest volunteer movement in the country. It's 6 million plus people who are in membership one way or another. And we are that independent barometer of what is going on. So distilling that into an agenda of workplace change is absolutely, I think, the right thing. But I go back to what I said earlier. I think we now must rapidly graft the fundamental philosophy onto it.
Right.
The 100 days was right to get it into a position where, and inevitably, the government had to face up to the howls from certain quarters that if you make any change, if you regulate in any way, you're going to impact business adversely, and you have to tune that out. Otherwise, working people will continue to be exploited. But having now shaped it up overall, fine-tuning it, the final consultations over the next year or so are what will make the difference to whether it lands and is successful. You see, unions have still a lot of power, but what I also am aware of is that, a lot of employers have deep pockets. And what we don't want is a situation where they're simply going to build higher walls and buy bigger locks to keep us out, because there will lie conflict. So there needs to be a situation where employers accept that public policy after a democratic vote in an election has changed. Unions have a role, working people have rights. You have to accept that as the construct, and we're not deregulating. But how we do it, you need to be part of that process. But what you can't say is the process shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And that's the shift for employers. And I think wise employers, I talked about working with the CIPD, and there's sometimes some of the CBI commentary is a little bit more angular. Probably would be. There's understandable concerns from small businesses.
Yeah. Because
they're hard pressed at the best of times with, very small margins. And again, that's where the nature of employment rights, helping them to understand where state institutions like ACAS need to be properly resourced so they can support small businesses in how they go about navigating this. Small businesses can't have a complete free-for-all, and just because they're small, be beyond basic standards. But is there a need to make sure that small businesses, as represented through the voice of the FSB and others, are being heard at the table? Absolutely. Because again, one thing I can say is that unions have got a long history of having things done to them, usually by governments of the centre-right. So we know what it feels like. And there can be a tendency to say, it's our turn now. It's our turn. Bit of revenge time. Ultimately, though, political things change. And the problem with UK employment law, it's been a political football. And once the government of a right comes back, it dismantles it.
Yeah.
We need a durable settlement. Durable settlements of employment rights in decent and balance with the rights of businesses to grow and prosper is what is the hallmarks of strong economies across the world. And, when the right has come to power in parts of Scandinavia, one thing or another, it'll make changes, but it don't change the fundamentals. It accepts the fundamentals of the settlement. I think we need to find in the UK a settlement that allows UK businesses to succeed, but working people not to be exploited. And what's interesting is that when capitalists from different parts of Europe come to the UK, my experience has been they behave then like UK capitalists because it's like it's a bit Wild West. We're free now, whereas they wouldn't do that in their home economies. So that's where we need a level up.
Right.
That's where we need a level up. No problem with businesses making money, being successful within bounds, because that will mean job security, better employment, a better economy. That's what we want. But hang on, you can't do that. Just on your own untrammeled authority.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about, accepting this new settlement. How far do you think employers are on this journey of accepting there is going to be this new landscape in terms of workers' rights?
Well, look, there'll be some employers influencing their lobby groups that play this as long as possible. There'll be in another election and we might be able to get away with not much happening before 29. That is really unwise. Because if you look beneath a lot of the survey evidence, this point about workplace dissonance doesn't just exist in workplaces in the UK where there's trade unions. There's a much greater dissonance and feeling that we don't get treated fairly. It can be amplified through trade unions where they exist, but if you look at the various means by which employers are talked about these days, whether it's survey, Glassdoor, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
I've said to a lot of employers, what you actually need is the barometer of the union in your workplace. You need people to talk to who are workplace leaders, who are able to bring the views of the workforce to you in an authoritative way, in the way that you believe. Sometimes you're not going to want to hear it, but nonetheless, it's important for your business to do so. And at times that they will annoy you, but on other times you think, I needed to hear that. We've lost a lot of that.
Right.
We've lost a lot of that. And I think there is this real opportunity now for the ERB to be seen as the means by which our conversations in the workplace are better. And again, as I say, 26, 27 is going to be crucial to it. So employers hoping that this is going to go away if they play it long. I don't think they're listening to the workforce more generally.
Right, okay. And what are the next steps? You talked about a period of consultation and 26, 27 being crucial. I mean, what will you be focusing on in the build-up to the bill becoming law? So
my team's been doing a huge amount of work on this, and it'll be what really dominates our workloads in terms of our comms and our research for the next year or so. So there's a raft of consultations which will be necessary for things like the access rights, what's fair access into a workplace, digitally or physically. There'll then be questions about, better ways for trade unions to gain recognition. I mean, even talking to your listeners about recognition, and it means everything in the world of work with trade unions and employers. It can mean absolutely nothing to working people, but it means it's the space in which an employer has agreed it will deal with a union.
Yeah,
it recognises the union, and usually that's for collective bargaining. So that's crucial from the perspective of can we regrow trade unionism in the private sector.
Yeah.
Then there will be a raft of consultations around the process around fire and rehire. In terms of day one rights, and those will be chunky and they'll be detailed. And I think that's why I say these are the things where you've got to take employers with you.
Yeah.
Not change fundamentally the direction, but hear them in a way that we want to be heard, and in the consultation process, make sure that when these things land in a workplace, they do what they say on the tin.
Yeah.
And they work. So that will be the work that comes, and there will be some rights then beginning to. I mean, obviously, the bill should make royal assent in September, October. And then within 2 months, certain things will change. So they will annul, they will remove parts of the 2016 Act, which were particularly troublesome. They'd already, no one's using the minimum service levels because it was a completely unnecessary set of provisions anyway under the last administration. So those things will land first, and then there'll be consultations as we go.
Yeah.
And then, there's a roadmap now published. Business knows when it's coming. I think that roadmap is got a pretty challenging pace to it. But nonetheless, people now know that's when these things are going to happen.
Yeah. And how much of the duty is on trade unions to try and appeal to potential members in a different way? You talked about, regrowing trade unionism in the private sector. Do unions have to behave or present themselves a bit differently to attract, the modern workforce?
Well, we think so. I will take the opportunity to say that we've been growing year in and year out now for 7 or 8 years. Mm-hmm. And the most brutal measure of a trade union is, are you growing? Because if you're growing, and we're a multi-sector union, public and private, different parts of the private sector, you're doing something right. You're appealing to people in a way that meets their needs. If you're not growing, then you need to potentially reflect. The trade union movement generally, has not grown. It's either plateaued. Last year it was down a bit. And I think that can be because sometimes we spend too much time in the media killing fields of all we do is take strike action. Mm. And therefore, that gives you a negative image. Mm. I think shouting and arguing a lot, particularly if you are a male trade union leader, you need to think very carefully about what image you're giving here to people who have a greater diversity and what they want to see from their trade union leaders. When the union movement's improved its own leadership diversity significantly, I'm proud that my own senior management team's predominantly female. We can always do more in terms of our own internal cultures. But I think what we think is you've got to offer trade unionism, but not on a Fordist basis or with the fact that we know best for you. Yeah. You've got to understand that I think contemporary workforces are relatively sophisticated with social media and other contacts. They've got a lot of information. They can buy into the collective philosophy, but they also want to see service. So if they want advice, it needs to be there in a timely manner, in a way that they can understand and engage with, and which doesn't look different to the rest of their service landscape. Yeah. And I think you've also got to be a little bit more flexible and permeable. Unions got to make policy. So you can't make policy on the basis of the opinions of 5 or 6 people. But policy formulation, meetings, how we do that, they need to be inclusive, inviting. And our policies, I think, need to be particularly anchored in the workplace. Unions have rightly a huge reputation for speaking on social and geopolitical issues. But the biggest crisis for the UK is in the workplace. Mm. And I think we really need to anchor ourselves, if we're going to have a future, in being workplace experts, enabling people collectively and individually to navigate their workspace, but not absolutely prescribing it to them. And knowing that they'll also do probably multiple jobs in their lives. And that the union is their one certain independent friend throughout that life journey. That's what we would like to try and get over to people as a trade union. Yeah, if you're in a workplace where we've achieved collective bargaining, we'll negotiate your pay and conditions. If you go somewhere else, we're still there to be able to revise you on your individual contract or talk to you. And sometimes what is sadly missed is all the pastoral work that trade unions and their representatives do in a workplace, where people come to us with things they want to talk about, problems they have. Sometimes they can't talk to their family members, or they don't want to worry people, or that people around them may not understand the particular issues. That's where the union really it's one of the reasons I dedicate my life to working for trade unions. They are a for-good organisation, And we sometimes have to do collective opposition and do it well. I'm privileged of being a general secretary of a union that can close the skies and turn the power off. So we do it selectively. Yeah. But what we're always there for is our members individually. And I think that's been part of the alchemy that's allowed us to grow successfully in recent years. Okay. And just off the Employment Rights Bill, lastly, you've spoken before about the challenge of building the workforce for big, infrastructure projects, national projects that the government wants to implement in order for the economy to grow. How does the bill fit into this bigger picture of needing to build those skills, particularly in the landscape of, increasing negativity around immigration, for example? Well, it's interesting. I was listening this morning before I came here to a quite assertive, and I'm say welcomely assertive speech from Nick Thomas Simmons about the government's.
I listened to it as well.
You did. I listened to the government's next stage after the Common Understanding in May. Prospect members actually voted 70% to remain, and that fortunately is for me. I would represent whatever the policy the members decide, but it fits with my own personal views. And I think Brexit has been the greatest economic damage that this country's done to itself. And a closer relationship with the European Union, whilst respecting manifesto red lines from Labour and respecting the vote, is absolutely necessary. So I think that's an important backdrop to all of this, that we have lost 4 to 5% of GDP through the agreement we did strike. So again, the next year or so in that respect is crucial. The government, we welcome industrial strategy. Government employers working in key sectors of the economy, let's take energy and defence as examples, I think can successfully work together to create both prime employers and supply chains which have high standards. Hopefully, quite a lot of that unionised, and that there is a corollary between public investment and a degree of conditionality where the quality of work, the attitude to the workforce, and do you work with a trade union are factors which the supply chain and the prime employers in these areas are willing to be measured against. So I think that, employment rights bill, industrial strategy, I'd say the same in the DCMS area as well, actually, because sometimes it's forgotten how big an important part of the economy that is, measured in many, many billions. So those areas are good examples where I think the government can incubate and demonstrate that employers, unions, civic society can work well together and deliver for the long term. In that, if we get ourselves on an upward economic trajectory, those who wish to create an image of this country where othering is an acceptable political currency, hopefully will fade into the past and into the darkness from where they come. We need a sensible immigration policy when it comes to skilled labour. Lots of employers will say they can't do it just from the indigenous population. There has to be a healthy approach linking of education, further education, and a development of the UK workforce, but also an acceptance that a richness, a positivity comes from people who come from other lands to work in this country for a period of time, and we also need that, and that's demonstrated by a whole range of numbers in different sectors. But crucially, what people have got to feel is that they're getting a fair deal here. And if you go right back to the beginning of this podcast, the ERB and Make Work Pay is the best way Labour's going to have of making people feel they're going to get a fair deal, and that appeals to these negative views of other people from other places are simply just not attractive.
Do you worry that the government might risk not striking the right balance in trying to limit the numbers of people who come to this country, legally, as well as, the asylum issue, in trying to placate that area of public opinion?
I don't think Labour can win in 29 by being reform light. I think that Labour has to have a distinctive policy where it accepts that there is a national consciousness that wants to see fair immigration and not illegal immigration on our shores, but to do that from the basis that, this country is not xenophobic, it's open, it's positive internationally, and it will do its fair share in terms of supporting people who are persecuted elsewhere. And I still think that there is an innate sense of fairness across this country that Labour and other politicians should tap into, such that we isolate those politicians whose only offer is preposterous suggestions, which they know they won't have to put into power because they're not going to win power, but preposterous suggestions that put pressure upon the mainstream policy making and take it in the wrong direction. Labour will need to be firm on this. I think Labour's roots, whatever form of left or socialist you are open-minded and you are wanting to embrace the diversity that the world can offer. And I think for young people, I think, to younger family members. For me, I want them to be able to travel, live and love and do what they wish across the globe. And I think we need to have that reciprocity, but to make sure that that's not just a middle class ambition.
Yeah,
that's an ambition that can be realised for everybody. I grew up in Anfield. I never thought I'd travel to half the places I've been to, but that's because I've been fortunate to have a good career. That's the aspiration for everyone, because that openness means that the appeals to that we're seeing from certain politicians just simply won't have traction.